What was a fairly, I think, thorough panel. In fact, a fairly thorough perspective
First
on the oil
Nations up
sands.
there are being
And I'm just going to conclude, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answers. And I promised you the sex and the drugs. So this is where the sex and drugs comes in. Truly, the sex and drugs does come in. I asked Rick Hansen and a number of individuals from the Calgary Police to actually talk to us today about the criminality associated with the oil sands. Because if we think this is just economics versus environment, then we're missing the whole socio-political aspect of this, which is drugs addiction, sexual exploitation, prostitution, transient population, high unemployment, families separated. All of this is happening in the northern sphere of Alberta. And the problem is we don't have the data on it. So to conclude that panel, I'm going to point you all to the Royal Society report, which I think is one of the best reports that we currently have. And one of the conclusions of the Royal Society report, or rather the consistent conclusion of the Royal Society report on the oil sands, is that we don't know. How are the water tables? We don't know. How are the cancer rates? We don't know. How are the prostitution rates? We don't know. We don't know. We don't have the empirics. We haven't been doing the measures. We don't have the sociological data. So we don't know actually what is happening. And I'll just leave you with this. In terms of research, when you take a look at NATO and United Nations refugee camps, or you take a look at post-war reconstruction regions around the world, or you take a look at townships in South Africa, or you look at transient worker populations in the Sudan and China, every one of those has sociological data around increased rates of prostitution, drug addiction, and STDs. Northern Alberta would be the unique circumstance in the world. It would be the only place that has a highly gendered, male-dominant, transient population to not have equivalent increases in prostitution, STD, unwanted pregnancies, and the whole gamut of health effects. But we don't know. We have no data on that. So that's where the sex and the drugs comes in, because they are very serious issues. And if we're not doing that sort of research, how in the hell do we create public policy around these things? So to take it beyond just the economics and the environment, we do have to take a look at those broader socioeconomic and political issues as well. Okay, so why don't we open it up then to questions? The mic is at the front. You don't have to come up to the microphone if you have a question, so you can ask from your seat. And just let us know actually who your question is for, or whether it's for the entire panel. So who's going to be the first? Yeah. And if you want to just stand up and say your name, thanks. We might give you the mic actually, because we can't hear.
I can speak up, I don't need a mic.
Yeah,
my name is Leanne. I'm my last year of environmental science here. And I have a few questions. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but my first question is regarding First Nations communities in the oil sands region. And I was wondering, I'm a bit confused about some of the things that were said. Okay, so it's Crown land, correct? So the government sets the rules. Is that the government of Canada you're talking about then?
Alberta.
Government of Alberta, okay. So I was wondering why mineral rights are given to oil companies, and maybe, Susannah, you can give me some insight on if you do consult with First Nations, but why are they given before First Nations are consulted? Because federally, we have a duty to consult from treaties. So I was a bit curious about that. And any
the mineral rights, they're not given.
Did you want to start?
Ignore it.
Alberta, the province, that's the Crown land. It's owned by the citizens. They are the owners. You set the rules through your government. Whether it's a Korean oil company, Shell, Total, Meg Energy, Syncrude, Suncor, they buy the rights. If they don't develop the rights in a certain period of time, they lose them. But they buy the rights. The Mackay First Nation is certainly within vicinity of the Syncrude joint venture. There is a significant First Nations population in Fort Chip. Many of the oil sands companies that I'm aware of go out of their way, particularly Syncrude, to not only encourage First Nations individuals to work at the site, but also develop businesses so they too can prosper. Many of the First Nations people that I meet around Fort McMurray are very supportive of the oil sands developments, but when you go to Fort Chip, where they have issues with cancer, with water, with the fish in Lake Athabasca, they have a different attitude entirely, for valid reasons in my view.
If I could just build on that a little bit. On the Aboriginal accommodation, consultation accommodation, it is a federal authority, which has been delegated to the province, which then delegates to the individual companies to go out and consult with the First Nations. It's not a perfect process at all, actually. I think one of those issues that I think the Alberta government and the federal government and we in the industry need to deal with is how do we make this process better for everybody involved? There's always a question about how do we facilitate the consultation and accommodation of the First Nations in terms of preparing or allowing them to come and have these discussions. So at the moment it's a one-off, and that's not good enough, I think, for anybody. In terms of Aboriginal corporations participating in the oil sands, I think the numbers I saw for 2009 are about $810 million a year go to Aboriginal corporations which participate in the oil sands. That's not enough to address concerns relative to Fort Chip on the health issue. Maybe if I could just spend a second there, I'd say simply this, that there is a real willingness to get to the bottom of the health issue. And I would tell you that it's not the industry that's holding it up. I think that if any company feels that there's an impact on the people around which they operate, that's an issue, and we want to get to the bottom of it. So there's no question that we want to know if there are real health impacts associated with the oil sands, because we don't want that liability.
We'll just pass the mic around.
Oh, it's okay, I don't need a mic. Actually, I'd like to have this lady's,
Can you hear at the back though?
or I'd just like to have the question answered, because certainly First Nations up there are saying they are not being negotiated with, they are not being brought into the fold. Was Dr. Schindler invited to this or not? Because boy, would I love to have more of his research presented here. So I would like to have that young lady's question answered, please. Maybe we could start with Andrew Nikiforuk and the gentleman from the Pembina Institute, please. Thank you.
No, there's been an inadequate consultation with First Nations. I mean, that's another huge moral challenge associated with this project. Yes, there are a lot of Aboriginal folks that are involved in the project. There are many more that are dramatically affected by the project. There are many First Nations communities, particularly south now of Fort McMurray, where the steam plants are going, who don't feel they've been properly consulted in regards to the changes that are occurring in terms of wildlife, the disappearance of woodland and caribou, the effects on groundwater, the air pollution they have to deal with. So no, there has never been really effective negotiations. I mean, I've had elders tell me stories that the negotiations consisted of, you know, a $300 check, a baseball cap, and a couple of pens, and that was the negotiation. That's shameful in this day and age. That's where we would be.
The current practice right now is absolutely no consultation before the mineral leases are sold. And if you look at the mining areas, 99% of those mineral leases are sold. If you look at the situ as well, over 2/3. And that's after the exploration has taken place, after these companies have invested a lot of money to find out where are the profitable assets. So it's very difficult to have any sort of equitable or honest conversation about if that land should be developed when you already know you're all in, you want that property developed. And that's very problematic for a lot of Aboriginal folks in the area. And it's really split, you know, like even I have people from Fort McKay who've called me and have expressed their displeasure as well at how their own leadership in their band treats or you know, operates within the oil sands company. Because, you know, they may, certain people within their band may profit very well from the oil sands development. Other people, not at all. There still are drinking water concerns. There's still some very fundamental problems around social services and access to healthcare in those communities, and those aren't necessarily being resolved by you know, the consultation or anything like that that's taking place.
Yeah, I think that's actually an entirely applicable question. I mean, from a federal perspective especially, and not just specifically with regards to oil sands, I think your comments are entirely appropriate, Nathan, because the assumption that somehow First Nations communities are homogenous, first of all, and second of all, that the people doing the negotiating are necessarily representative of the entire community is bull. And that is bull. right? And that is basically how we've gone about negotiating these things, in particular in the oil sands. And that's a significant issue for Alberta reserves, especially. So those councils, breaking that down and seeing the heterogeneity within those councils and asking who's actually being represented by these negotiators is a question that both the province and the federal government have to get to grips with. Yeah, this question. Sorry, where did that mic go? Did we leave? Oh, sorry, Marlene, I didn't see it. So we'll just go here and then we'll come back. Is that okay?
Okay. I have a question for Todd. Just you left all by yourself. You mentioned that the economics of the oil sands required a $70 barrel, and yet up to the middle of last year, Syncrude advertised on its website that they produce Syncrude sweet blend for between $27 and $29 a barrel, all costs in, including paying back whatever money they had to pay back for bank loans, etc. So I think that the difference between 29 bucks and 70 bucks is a little bit extreme for simple profit. The other one is...
Well, just to clarify that, maybe I wasn't clear, but I was referring to the in-situ projects, not the
okay. Well, the other one is, you point out that economics makes sense to ship the bitumen south because there's capacity there. Yes, it would make sense to the people who have the capacity there. It does not make sense to people in Alberta. Because it makes economic sense, fine. If I have a refinery in Texas and I'm screwed out of my heavy oil, that's my problem. It shouldn't be a problem that is addressed by Albertans. It should be a problem that is addressed by Texas.
Do you want to respond?
well, the only thing I would say to that is you're absolutely right. I was just talking about the economics, but your point is valid and well made.
Is there another question? Yes.
I'm sure really pleased that you're keeping your eye on the Syncrude Joint Venture's financial statements. Their production costs have gone up, even as natural gas prices have reduced. Production costs now are $34 a barrel, and I believe as of December 31st, the royalty amount was $7.07 a barrel. And I would compare that, and I get in trouble in the Legislative Assembly whenever I do, but I would compare that to what a Conservative Premier in Newfoundland, you know Newfoundland, the province with the $1 billion surplus in the Treasury, that province, Mr. Williams, a Conservative Premier, negotiated on behalf of his people. He acted like an owner. The same time period in the financial statement, Suncor, which operates now in Newfoundland as a result of their acquisition of Petro-Canada, pays $28 a barrel in royalties. Close to 28, it's a penny or two less than 28 bucks. So there's the difference. And I know it's a different production scale, I know there's different costs, but that's an example of two conservative provinces with totally different royalty structures. Thank you.
Just a quick comment before I ask my questions. Suncor, I don't think would exist if we had never had the NEP. So it's something that we need to keep in mind when that question comes up. But in situ production was raised as one of the matters, and the statement was made that it increases greenhouse gases. Now, I have seen the prototype in the Faculty of Engineering here, where the oil is separated underground, and so the only thing that comes up is the good oil. And so I would think that that would reduce our greenhouse gases. And just one other thing, I've seen a lot of ads by our oil companies. I think that they do wonders. They work together and share their research. And some of the water that they're using is deep well saline water, so that they're really going under the water table. So that, I think, helps. And the tailing ponds research, now they seem to be able to solidify that in just 2 weeks. I compliment our corporations in Alberta for what they are trying to do. We've made a lot of mistakes in the past, but let's look at the future and what good we have right now going out and get that word out around the world.
Oh yeah, so I was going to make a comment.
Shell said 10 years.
Thanks for that. I feel a little bit warmer now. With respect to what you were talking about in terms of the in-situ, the SAGD, which is essentially the most common process right now, uses steam to heat up the crude. And so as a result, that's where the emissions come from. But you're absolutely right, there's a lot of efforts that are being made to do it underground so you can reduce the amount of the emissions. I'd like to make one comment on tailings. There is obviously, and I tried to make this point, there's recognition that as the oil sands grow from the mining perspective, we do have an issue relative to the tailings ponds. I would like to note one additional achievement, which I didn't when I was in my stream of consciousness earlier, and that is that there was a collaboration which was announced last December. And this collaboration was essentially between all of the mining companies which have significant tailings ponds, Syncrude, Suncor, Imperial Shell, CNRL. We came together and we finally realized that if we continue to go down the path of not sharing our intellectual property, of not sharing our technological achievements, we will never solve the tailings issue. So collaboration was announced last December, the beginning of it, so I'm not going to tell you we've made any measurable results yet, but it's significant to the extent that you look at private corporations who have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in individual technologies to come together and say enough is enough, let's pull this together, let's develop a work plan, let's put aside our IP, let's get a better technology solution by sharing our results. So that was announced last December. It's just another small step and marker that they're listening and they're trying to make a difference. So thanks for your comments.
So I'm not going to be so fuzzy and warm, and I'm going to actually disagree with you, Marlene. I would really seriously question any data that tells me that tailings ponds are being cleaned up and water tables are safe in that short period of time. And the reason I would question that actually is just pure empirics. Again, I mean, I like data. I don't necessarily care about facts, I like data, right? Because facts are constructed out of data. And the University of New Brunswick has spent years in its geochemistry and geosciences departments looking at water tables. And my sister was part of that research project, and for years, she researched tailings ponds and water table pollution for mines that were shut down well over 30 years ago, mines that were tiny in comparison to what we're looking at in the oil sands, right? So those water tables were still being polluted, toxicity leaking into those water tables, tailing ponds not being addressed, and the New Brunswick government still not talking about it, okay? Now, that to me says, I think we've got an issue, and I'm not going to look to industry for the data on that, because that's such a huge matter that even the Royal Society report talks about these particular issues and says, frankly, we don't have enough research going into it from an independent source. So either it's independently funded university sources or they're independently government-funded sources of experts, whatever that source of information is. When it comes to tailing ponds and water seepage and toxicity, I think New Brunswick has a lot of data to show us that we're in for a big fight in terms of cleaning it up, right? So I would like to warrant a little bit of caution on that front.
I'm not saying that we've solved the problem. I'm saying we are working on solving our problems, and let's publicize what we're doing to try to resolve.
I would say we need to work harder. So.
Could I respond quickly to that? And it is this way. There is currently a project underway in the Fort McMurray region, a $40 million plus project that I believe is associated with this university, where they're going to experiment with using solvents instead of water and natural gas to heat the water to lift the bitumen from the well. And the idea is to eliminate large volumes of water and large volumes of natural gas to produce the bitumen. This is a test pilot project that's going on. It's proprietary to the nature of this solvent. I have no idea what it will do to the water table. I'm not saying anything about that. But I do know that this project is going ahead, and it's an example of just what you are talking about.
We have time for about 3 more questions.
Just what solvent? Sorry.
It's proprietary. Proprietary means he's not privy to the information.
Yeah, my question is when I'm here, so this is working? Okay. You spoke of making oil sands operations carbon neutral, and you spoke of carbon capture and storage, so I presume that was your means for doing that. That would be great if it was carbon neutral, that removed most of the problems that have to be oil sands. If people said tomorrow you can't extract another ton of carbon from the ground without putting it back again, how fast could you ramp up to match your entire production in sequestration? Could you do it all with Lemphers in Alberta? How many years before you ran out and to go somewhere else? what would the cost be for it? Have you got the engineering plans for this?
No. I think the shorter answer is, how fast could we do it? I think we're evaluating that right now. I think that if you take a look, it really depends, and I think I agree with the notion that we really don't have right now a very liquid market for carbon. A very liquid market for carbon. So in terms of where, I do agree with, is this working? I do agree with the panelists, is that if you look at the overall emissions profile of Alberta, and you look at our ability to actually use the Alberta system to either push it to the tech fund or buy offsets, there's not enough of a market here to reduce the carbon footprint of the amount of emissions that Alberta produces. So from the Shell-only perspective, I don't have an answer to tell you right now that if I looked at it tomorrow, how many offsets we need to buy, we're going to capture 1 million tons per year. We're looking at what we can do right now, but it'd probably be within Alberta, because that's the only carbon market we have. The moment we got CCS, 1 million tons a year, we'd be looking at offsets in terms of buying land in the boreal forest, or restoring land, and the various other offsets, which right now apply under the Alberta system.
Are you worried about how accurately one can do the scientific accounting for some of those more flexible offsets?
Well, and that's the question right now which has to be asked if you design the offset system in the Alberta carbon markets. You have to ask that question, and that's the perennial question we have right now when you talk about a Canadian national CO2. Whether it's a cap and trade, whether it's a carbon price, in the international realms too, it's how do you design the offsets? Those are also political questions. Because if you design an offset where you can buy an offset overseas as opposed to in Alberta, is that good for Albertans?
So there are many potential government regulatory frameworks for trying to achieve carbon neutrality, and you don't have a precise plan for achieving any of them.
Sorry, did you hear the back? She said, so there's very many regulatory or possible regulatory frameworks that companies could use, and yet there appears to be no precise framework.
No, I may not have the plan because I'm just not knowledgeable enough to tell you what our engineers are doing, but I'll tell you this, that we take signals from where the carbon prices are to develop what we need to do to reduce our carbon footprint. We know what our carbon footprint is. We know that as we expand the oil sands, that carbon footprint will grow. We know that what we need to do is reduce our carbon intensity, and if we can continue to look at ways where we know that an offset is accounted for as a carbon offset, then that's what we'll do. I can tell you we have a goal to do that. I can't tell you precisely how we're going to do it yet. No.
So in a best case scenario, with you achieving carbon neutrality as soon as possible, how soon would that be?
Okay, again, this is the question about that I can't necessarily answer for you right now, not simply because we don't have an answer, just that I don't personally have the answer.
Okay, so we don't have an answer basically on how quickly we can become carbon neutral as a response, right?
I don't have an answer on how specifically Shell and our oil sands can become carbon neutral.
Thank you
very much. Great. One question, I'm an engineering student, graduate student here studying sustainable transportation. So I'm on kind of the other side of the problem. How do we look at human behavior and create better systems that reduce the need for energy? I feel that's one point that nobody touched on tonight, is we complain about the oil sands, we complain about the pollution, we talk about the need to grow industry, but then we look at our, our microphones that are made of hydrocarbons and everything in this room that was brought from hydrocarbons, about talking about what kind of systems are we actually building that make it so someday we don't need choosing between renewable energy or CO2, so our base loads are smaller because our consumption of energy is smaller. So let's maybe the panelists, you've had some great critical thoughts on the oil sands development, which are currently fueling our economy and fueling our livelihood. Talk about, well, how do we reduce our need for energy? Because right now it's kind of the state we're in where we need a lot of energy. We need the industry to sustain our way of life.
Does anybody have a specific response? Okay, so a few of us have comments. So for those of you at the back, if how do we actually reduce our energy consumption, change our consumption patterns is the question.
It's a really good question, and it's another big moral challenge, and it's the moral challenge that we don't really want to address, and that is how much energy are we really entitled to as a people? I mean, the average Canadian consumes 24 barrels of oil a year. The average person in China is around 5. The average person in India is 1. The average person in Japan is 16. The average person in Europe is around 16 as well. So, Ivan Illich, who's a Catholic theologian, put it this way. What he noticed about high energy societies was the amount of what they were prepared to sacrifice in terms of happiness, in terms of the environment that surrounded them, and what they were prepared to put at risk. So we are now, all of us, particularly here in North America, extremely high energy, high carbon societies. The challenge for us is to find ways to be happier with less energy, and I think we will be much happier with less energy, and then we'll also be making less carbon. You know, whenever we go on holidays, which we always like to do, and you know, we get on a jet plane and off we go, we tend to go to low carbon societies, whether it's in Latin America or in Asia, and we like the pace of life there. We like how familiar people are there, how friendly they are, how much time they spend with their families. They're not, you know, high octane North Americans keeping themselves busy burning up oil all the time. So this is the fundamental ethical and moral challenge for us. This is why the debate about this project will not go away, because it has become a metaphor for how much we consume and for excess consumption. And really the debate is, the world doesn't need more energy. The world needs to learn how to live with less energy and less destructive energy.
I completely agree with you that the demand side of the conversation isn't taking place, that everyone likes to poke holes and throw eggs at oil sands. It's an easy target. It's sort of the middle point in an hourglass. But what really needs to happen is that we change our lifestyle, that, you know, energy companies are supplying our energy needs, right? Well, if we change our energy needs, we wouldn't need that particular form of energy. But it's, you know, there's certainly the ethical and moral argument which needs to happen, but it's also the leadership and the vision coming from governments as well, and their roles and responsibility. It's taken a very long time and a lot of backroom arm twisting, I think, to get all of the oil sands companies together and start sharing technology on tailings. Whereas that could have been facilitated so much faster by government if they had a proper innovation policy in place, if they had research units that were well funded. You know, Dr. Schindler was saying that, you know, a new world-class monitoring system, $10 to $15 million. These companies are making millions of dollars by the hour, and the government is making could make a significant amount of money as well. Yet we can't scrape together the amount of money to do you know, simple monitoring. So it comes down to the vision of the government as well, and what sort of leadership they want to have as well.
I was just going to make a quick comment that, you know, actually William Thomson made the same argument to the Scottish government in the 1860s, that unless you actually have investment in the laboratory science, unless you have investment in innovation, you don't change the patterns of behavior. But I'm going to take it right out of morality. Forget morality, because if we were moral and ethical, we wouldn't do a lot of things we do. Right? We wouldn't govern in a lot of the ways that we govern. So the question, I would restate your question is, how do we make it too expensive for you to live the carbon-intensive life that you're currently living? How do we make it economically unviable for you to be living the style of life that you're living, for me to be printing off all these papers, for me to be wearing polyethylene shoes? How do we make that too expensive? That's when we start to change.
How do you do it without hurting the most vulnerable citizens?
Yeah, and there we have a larger debate, I think, within the context of how do we make sure, because obviously a lot of the developing countries, and even lower class individuals in Canada in terms of economically lower class or suppressed economically, suffer whenever we change these from top down, in terms of top down policies that change our patterns of behavior, right? So as soon as we increase the cost of carbon, we increase the cost of gas or oil or whatnot, we're hurting the weak and worst off, and I agree with you. So it at least has to start with a discussion about where that has to begin, and that has to begin back to William Thomson, with a government that's willing to actually have political motivation and engage in these discussions and create policy. Stick your neck out there and create some policy. That's how we actually have to start addressing these issues. So we're going to take one last question. The lady's had her hand up at the back of the room forever and anon. So, are you sure? Okay.
I guess my comment was some of the way you just summed this up, that it's not the oil companies that we need to hold accountable. Like, they will behave in a way that's going to make them money, that's going to make their shareholders. There's a market now for worldwide oil. They're going to do what they can to meet it. And they're going to lobby our government and spend millions of dollars to get what they want out of it. And our government has to set up the regulatory body, and it has to stand for the principles and the values. But those come from the Albertans. Those come from the Canadian public. And when the Canadian public, Alberta has not stood up in the last 20, 30, 40 years to talk about any proper monitoring systems, environmental structures, the walls we talked about. The only reason we're getting pressure on those issues now, where the oil companies are coming together to figure out, is because of worldwide agreement. It has not come from Alberta. We have not pressured our government. There's been too much, I don't know why necessarily, maybe too much money, too much opportunity. But if we're going to get our government to change the things that we suggest that they have to, it's the people who are going to vote for somebody beside a conservative who is going to sit there and just do what they've done. So, stand up with those values and be the person that Mr. Nikiforuk suggested, that a politician stand up, and whether it be federally as well, because the federal government is a president. But we elect our governments, and if we want to change the government, it comes back to the moral values that each one of us as a citizen, and that's what we do. So that's a comment.
I want to say thank you for your comments. Take a look at my postcard. It says your vote does count. And frankly, in Alberta, we have one of the highest voter apathy rates in the country. That is not untied to the industrial development of this province. We have high voter apathy rates, and I completely concur with you. Until citizens actually make a choice as to which sort of government they want governing them, then we've got no chance here, right? We've got no chance. And I'm just going to share one little anecdote with you, and some of you may have something to say to her, but last week, or about 2 weeks ago, I went to a Gowling seminar. Was anybody else there? Okay, so Gowling's the law firm. There was a seminar on the oil sands, an industry panel, very interesting. And yet, an individual from a petroleum association stood up representing industry, and so did his colleague. And they broke down the oil sands into 3 historical periods: pre-2000, 2000 to 2007, and post-2007. The pre-2000 had to deal with all that NEP stuff, where a bunch of development happened in the north, but nobody in Alberta paid attention because nobody was going to talk about it. There were no lobby groups, the environmental groups weren't together, so stuff was happening, but nobody was talking about it. 2000 to 2007, these individuals presented as the worst period in the oil sands history because of the rise of the environmental lobby. Okay, so this is a terrible period, according to this industry. To post-2007 is a period where industry has to come back, okay? The PR has to come back, industry has to save itself, we have to fight that Facebook war and win over the environmental Greenpeacers who are all Facebooking and tweeting their way to halcyon days of success, right? So this is the presentation. And after the panel, I asked the individual, and I'm not going to name him because I'm sure he has lawyers who will sue me for libel. He basically said to me, yeah, pre-2000, those were the best days. And I said, so what you're telling me is pre-2000 were the best days because nobody questioned. Because nobody asked questions. Because nobody knew what was going on up there. Nobody sent off their groups. Nobody was taking photos. So the company that was up there, the individual companies that were up there doing their developmental projects could get away with or just develop as they saw fit. Now that's not necessarily bad. The bad part is that he thought these were the great days of industry when nobody questioned. That to me is fundamentally treating the citizen as irrelevant. That is the exact diametrical opposite of a democratic state. And do we not have a constitution that sanctifies your right as an individual to vote and have your voice heard? Yes, we do. And in Alberta, for some reason, seeing pre-2000 is somehow the halcyon days of the oil industry, to me, is hugely problematic, governmentally problematic, and from a federal perspective, something to actually stake a platform on for the next federal election. And so, on to the conclusion of the evening, which is to leave you with the very fuzzy and warm feeling, but actually the activist feeling, that as we head into a federal election, presumably within the next fortnight or so, I have been assured, and thank goodness because many of us have lobbied for it within the party, for an energy platform. So we can all look forward to a very interesting energy vision platform within the Liberal Party platform that's going to be released if an election is called. And so we do look forward to your commentary on that, but I am proud to say that Alberta plays an important role in that energy platform as it's going to be released. So I look forward to that a great deal. And I'm just going to ask the panel whether they have any last statements to make. Nope, okay, good. And I want to thank you all for coming. And just one last thing, I do want to acknowledge another individual. Sorry, I didn't see you way at the back, Bruce. So we have Bruce Payne in the audience. Bruce is, have you declared, Bruce? Have you declared that you're running for the leadership? You have done. Okay, so Bruce is running for, no, okay. Okay, so we don't know, but there's Bruce Payne at the back. Bruce Payne will be basically running in
Harry Chase's.
In Harry Chase's former riding, but what's the official name of the riding again? Varsity. So Bruce Payne will be running in Varsity as an MLA. And I will not say anything else. So thank you very much for coming this evening, and I appreciate it. If you have any questions, let us know. Oh, and we do have some gifts for our panelists as well. We want to thank you to all the panelists. I want to thank you, Susannah, Hugh, Andrew, Nathan, and Todd for coming out this evening. So thank you to everyone.